The night the Western Allies nearly broke in half didn't happen in a German bunker. It happened inside the Allied command tent, under the same maps, the same oath, and the same pressure of a front that could collapse before dawn. It is late December 1944, and the Ardennes has erupted into the largest battle the Americans will fight in Europe. Lines are bent, units are scattered, and the one thing Eisenhower cannot afford, division, arrives from inside his own team. On one side stands George S. Patton, incandescent, convinced that speed and violence can cut a crisis apart before it hardens into disaster. On the other stands Bernard Montgomery, methodical, convinced that control and caution are the only way to prevent a catastrophe from becoming a rout. Both men believe they are saving the war, and both believe the other is about to lose it. Between them is Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of a coalition held together by trust, politics, and reputation as much as by tanks and ammunition, forced to make decisions that will keep the alliance intact even if they cost him personally. So the question is simple, and it's brutal. Why did Patton and Montgomery fight? And what did Eisenhower pay to keep them from tearing the victory apart? Two generals. Two wars inside one alliance because Patton and Montgomery were not merely different commanders, they were rival definitions of what winning was supposed to look like. Patton, born into cavalry tradition and obsessed with tempo, saw war as a contest of momentum. Strike first, strike hard, and never give an enemy time to think. His confidence was contagious, his language was explosive, and his belief in relentless attack became a kind of weapon in itself, turning staffs and divisions into engines that ran on willpower as much as fuel. Montgomery, shaped by the bitter arithmetic of the First World War and the early shocks of 1940 to 42, believed battle was something you designed before you entered it. Concentrate strength, remove uncertainty, and refuse to gamble lives on dash when planning could buy certainty. He cultivated the image of the careful professional, the general who would only fight when the odds were finally arranged in his favour. Even their relationship with publicity and politics widened the gap. Patton was a headline whether he wanted it or not, a lightning rod admired and feared. Montgomery used publicity deliberately, as a shield for confidence and a lever with leaders in London and the press corps. And that mattered, because the Allied war was not a single army marching under a single flag. It was a coalition, and coalitions are fragile machines. They run on agreements, egos, and the constant negotiation of who gets what, who gets credit, and whose plan becomes the plan. Eisenhower understood that reality better than anyone. He did not need his commanders to be friends, but he did need them to obey, to coordinate, and, most importantly, to accept decisions without turning strategy into a personal referendum. Yet Patton and Montgomery kept dragging the war toward their own philosophy, and every time they collided, it wasn't just two men arguing. It was the alliance risking paralysis at the worst possible moment. Before France, before the Rhine, it began in North Africa, inside a coalition that was still learning how to breathe together. In November 1942, Operation Torch put Americans ashore in Morocco and Algeria under Eisenhower's overall command, and one of the men pushing that landing into existence on the ground was George Patton, aggressive even in preparation, treating logistics and discipline as the first battle. At the same time, across the desert, Bernard Montgomery was rebuilding Britain's 8th Army and then breaking Rommel at El Alamein in October-November 1942, earning the aura of a saviour general whose confidence could steady a nation. By early 1943, the war in Tunisia turned brutal and educational. At Kasserine Pass in February, American forces were mauled and disorganized, suffering thousands of casualties and prisoners in a humiliating shock that threatened the entire Allied timetable. And Eisenhower responded by putting Patton in charge of the USD-2 Corps to restore order and combat power. Patton arrived like a storm, hard rules, tighter formations, relentless training, while Montgomery, advancing from the east, pressed his own campaign with a careful, scripted style that broadcast certainty. Neither man was wrong about what the situation demanded. What changed was how each measured competence and how loudly each claimed it. In the months that followed, as Tunisia collapsed and the Axis surrendered in May 1943, Eisenhower could already see the fault line. A British commander celebrated for method, and an American commander rising on raw force, both convinced the other's approach was either wasteful or timid, and both surrounded by staffs and politicians who turned battlefield performance into a contest for prestige. Sicily turned victory into a scoreboard, and a scoreboard is poison in a coalition because it makes partners compete in public for private pride. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily in Operation Husky, and Eisenhower's High Command paired Patton's US 7th Army with Montgomery's British 8th Army, expecting a two-pronged advance that would crack the island and open the Mediterranean. On paper, it was cooperation. In practice, it became a race shaped by clashing egos and incompatible plans. Montgomery wanted to drive toward Messina along the eastern axis and expected American forces to protect his flank, while Patton, stung by any implication that Americans were a supporting act, looked for an independent path that would prove American offensive power. The campaign was chaotic, the terrain harsh, the Axis defence stubborn, and in that pressure both men became more themselves. Montgomery insisted on concentration and deliberate pushes. Patton sought speed, amphibious leaps, and dramatic gains that would be impossible to ignore. The result was not just tactical friction, but narrative warfare. Who was advancing? Who was holding back? Who deserved the credit when the island fell? Patton's dash to Palermo and then to Messina became a headline-grabbing climax, while Montgomery's slower, grinding route fed resentment on his side that American showmanship was stealing a victory bought with British experience and casualties. Eisenhower could not escape the political consequences. Churchill's government watched Montgomery like an emblem of British competence. American leaders watched Patton as proof their army had matured since Kasserine. And inside Allied headquarters, arguments over roads, resources, and missions began to feel like judgments on national honour. Sicily ended with success, but the partnership cracked. The moment Patton and Montgomery started using the same battlefield as a platform for separate reputations, Eisenhower began paying the first installments of a price he would keep paying for the rest of the war, spending command authority not only on defeating Germany, but on preventing his own generals from defeating each other. Normandy brought their conflict out of whispers and into the machinery of strategy. Because after D-Day, the war stopped being an invasion and became a race to break Germany before it could recover. And Patton and Montgomery disagreed on how you win a race. The landings of June 6, 1944, created two very different battlefields. In the British and Canadian sector around Caen, German armour and strong defensive ground forced a grinding fight where every mile cost time and lives. In the American sector, the hedgerow country also bled units white, but the operational dream was different. Find the seam, rupture it, and turn a battlefield into open country. Montgomery, commanding the main Allied ground forces initially under the 21st Army Group, argued that holding the Germans around Caen and drawing their panzer reserves into that cauldron would set conditions for the American breakout. Critics, especially on the American side, saw it as slowness dressed up as design. Patton entered this stage like a match thrown into gasoline. The US Third Army was activated in August, and once Operation Cobra broke the German line at the end of July, Patton's style suddenly looked like prophecy. Long armoured thrusts, constant movement, an appetite for exploitation that treated hesitation as a kind of surrender. But the faster Patton moved, the sharper the coalition problem became, because success created competing demands. Montgomery pressed for resources to keep pressure in the north and execute a decisive thrust. Patton demanded fuel and priority to keep rolling east before German defences could solidify. Eisenhower was forced into the centre of an argument that was never purely military. Every allocation decision sounded like a referendum on which general, which doctrine, and which nation deserved to lead the war's main effort. And while German resistance was cracking, Eisenhower understood a deeper danger. If the alliance began believing the war would be won only the Montgomery way, or only the Patton way, then the coalition itself could fracture under the weight of victory's politics, right when unity mattered most. The race across France exposed the real battlefield between Patton and Montgomery, not maps, but fuel, trucks, bridges, and the authority to decide who gets them. After the breakout, Allied armies surged so fast that success became a logistical nightmare. Supply lines stretched back to Normandy, ports were not yet fully functioning, and the Red Ball Express, thousands of trucks running non-stop, could not magically give every army what it wanted at the same time. Patton's Third Army was built for exploitation and thrived on movement, but movement is an appetite that never stops. Every mile ate gasoline, ammunition, spare parts, and time, and by late August 1944, Patton's spearheads were repeatedly forced to pause, not because Germans stopped them, but because the supply pipeline did. Montgomery saw that bottleneck and argued that the coalition should stop feeding multiple advances and instead back one concentrated thrust toward the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, using the resources to create a single decisive blow. Patton saw that proposal as a polite way of saying, freeze the Americans while Britain finishes the war, and his anger wasn't only personal, it reflected Washington's impatience and the American belief that their growing strength should translate into strategic primacy. The argument became constant and corrosive. Patton complained that he could win if he were simply allowed to keep moving. Montgomery insisted that uncoordinated thrusts risked overextension and disaster. And Eisenhower stood in the middle, making allocation decisions that would inevitably humiliate someone. Every gallon of gas was now a political statement, every convoy a symbol of whose plan Eisenhower believed in, and every pause on Patton's front was reinterpreted as either necessary discipline or evidence of favoritism. The paradox was cruel. The Allies were winning so quickly that they were strangled by their own success, and in that strangulation Patton and Montgomery fought like men arguing over the steering wheel of a speeding vehicle, while Eisenhower had to keep the vehicle from crashing, even if it meant taking blame from both sides. Market Garden was the gamble that turned rivalry into fallout, because when a coalition makes a high-stakes bet, the argument afterward is never just about tactics. It's about judgment, credibility, and who should have been trusted in the first place. In September 1944, with German forces reeling but not yet broken, Montgomery proposed a bold plan. A narrow thrust into the Netherlands, seizing bridges with airborne troops and driving a ground column through to cross the Rhine and open a fast route into Germany. If it worked, it promised speed and a dramatic endgame, the kind of decisive stroke Montgomery believed could justify concentrating resources in the north. Eisenhower approved it, partly because he wanted a breakthrough before winter, and partly because the political pressure of visible progress was building, but approval carried a hidden cost, because it meant scarce fuel, trucks and attention flowed toward Montgomery's plan, while Patton's momentum was further constrained. The operation began on September 17th and immediately encountered the war's oldest enemy, friction. Radios failed, units landed, scattered, German resistance stiffened faster than expected, and the ground advance crawled along a single vulnerable corridor. The last bridge at Arnhem, key to the plan, held out under ferocious fighting and then slipped away, leaving the operation short of its decisive objective and the airborne forces mauled. In the aftermath, Patton's camp read the result as confirmation of everything they hated, that Montgomery could sell risk as method, could receive priority, and could still escape full responsibility when a gamble failed. Montgomery's camp defended the decision as a near success foiled by bad luck and constraints, arguing that the strategic vision had been sound and that setbacks were the price of ambition. Eisenhower, meanwhile, paid twice, first in resources diverted to the gamble, and then in the political and moral accounting when it did not deliver. He had to protect the coalition from tearing itself apart over blame, even as criticism rose in both London and Washington, and even as German recovery bought the enemy time that the Allies could never get back. Market Garden didn't merely fail to end the war. It sharpened the rivalry into something harder and more personal, because now each side believed the other had been proven wrong in front of history, and Eisenhower had endorsed the test. The Battle of the Bulge should have silenced their feud, because when an enemy punches through your centre in winter, pride is supposed to shrink to nothing, but pride is exactly what survived, and it survived because Patton and Montgomery interpreted the crisis as proof of their own righteousness. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, aiming to split Allied armies and seize Antwerp, and in the opening days, American units were battered, communications ruptured, and the front warped into a deep salient. It was the kind of emergency where command decisions are measured in hours, not weeks. Patton moved with the ferocity that made him famous. Within days, he executed one of the war's most difficult operational pivots, turning Third Army elements north in brutal winter conditions to relieve Bastogne and blunt the German thrust, and his staff work and speed became a lifeline for an army group at risk. Montgomery, commanding in the north, faced his own crisis. Units were shattered, lines had to be reformed, and the primary task was to prevent a breakthrough from becoming a collapse. He tightened control, reorganized defences, and demanded careful timing before counterattacks, exactly the method he always preached. Eisenhower, trying to restore coherence, made a decision that was militarily practical but politically explosive. To coordinate the northern defences, he placed US forces north of the Bulge temporarily under Montgomery's command, because command unity mattered more than flags in the middle of a fire. That move stabilized the situation, but it also ignited American resentment at the worst possible time, because it felt like a demotion handed to a British general already accused of arrogance, while Patton's camp saw it as yet another example of Montgomery being given authority without earning American trust. When the Germans were finally stopped and the counter-offensive began squeezing the Bulge shut, the battlefield victory should have restored unity. Instead, the credit fight returned almost immediately, fueled by briefings, press narratives, and the deeply human need to be seen as the man who saved the day. In that moment, the feud wasn't just noise, it was a threat to command itself, because an alliance can survive defeats and setbacks, but it can fracture when its leaders turn salvation into a competition. Eisenhower paid in the only currency a coalition commander truly spends, authority, and the debt was collected in public, in private, and in decisions that were strategically necessary but personally bruising. Every time Patton and Montgomery collided, Eisenhower had to do more than choose a plan. He had to choose which ally would feel slighted, which government would feel ignored, and which newspaper narrative would be allowed to grow, because in a coalition the front line is not just the battlefield, it's the relationship between capitals, commanders, and public confidence. His broad front approach, pushing across a wide line rather than betting everything on a single spearhead, was partly military logic and partly political survival, because concentrating resources behind one national commander could look like favoritism, and favoritism could crack the alliance. But that same balancing act guaranteed constant arguments over fuel, priorities, and credit, turning Eisenhower's headquarters into a pressure chamber where tactical requests came wrapped in national pride. He absorbed the anger when Patton's speed demanded supply that did not exist, and he absorbed the contempt when Montgomery's caution looked like delay. He endured being blamed for letting both men be themselves, even though his real job was to harness them without letting them poison each other. The Bulge exposed that cost brutally. The temporary decision to place American forces under Montgomery's coordination in the north was sound for command unity in an emergency. Yet it inflicted a political wound on Eisenhower with his own side, forcing him to spend trust to buy stability. And when Montgomery later spoke in ways many Americans heard as self-congratulation, Eisenhower had to contain the damage without detonating the alliance, because he could not afford a public feud while the war still had months of killing left. By 1945, the pattern was clear. Patton and Montgomery fought for the soul of the campaign, and Eisenhower paid by becoming the man who could never fully satisfy either. He won the war's essential unity, but he did it by swallowing insults, mediating egos, and making compromises that history could criticize precisely because they were designed to keep history from collapsing in the first place. So here is the verdict, and it is colder than the personalities. Patton and Montgomery fought because the Allied victory was built on incompatible virtues, speed and control, and both men believed their virtue was the only one that could finish the war without catastrophe. Patton's genius was momentum, the ability to turn an opening into a flood and make an enemy's decision cycle collapse. Montgomery's genius was structure, the ability to concentrate force, reduce uncertainty, and keep an army from bleeding itself to death in impatience. The tragedy is that coalitions need both, and coalitions also create the conditions where both become weapons against each other, because credit, prestige, and national pride ride on the same outcomes as casualties and territory. Eisenhower paid because he was the one man whose job was not to win an argument, but to win a war that Britain and America had to win together. He could not afford the perfect plan if the perfect plan shattered trust, and he could not afford to indulge genius if genius threatened unity. That is why the feud matters. It was never just two loud commanders. It was a lesson in leadership under pressure, where the enemy isn't only across the line, but inside your own camp. Ambition, resentment, and the temptation to prove yourself at the cost of the mission. And when you think back to that opening night, maps lit by lamplight, reports pouring in, the front bending under winter, understand what Eisenhower understood. The Germans could be beaten by firepower and strategy, but the alliance could only be saved by restraint, by choosing unity over ego again and again until the war finally ran out of road.